Rebekah. I'm not going to be presenting another SNARK construction today, unfortunately. And instead, I'm going to talk about what hash functions look like inside of SNARKs. And most importantly, like how we can achieve hashing inside of SNARKs efficiently. So the roadmap is I'm going to show the state of the art for arithmetic circuit-friendly hash functions, and the SNARKs presented so far today have been kind of varied in their computation model, which you can efficiently prove things about inside the SNARK. So I'm going to be focusing on ones that target R1CS. So think Roth 16. We want to be minimizing the amount of field multiplications. And so what I'm going to do is say, what do we need to keep in mind when choosing hash functions? What is going to be expensive, what is not? What properties do we need? What properties can we maybe do without? And then which hash functions best satisfy these requirements? So the first thing you might ask when you think of hashing inside of elliptic curves is, hashing inside of SNARKs is why can't we just do what we've been doing for the last 20 years, which is use a hash function which has been made really fast. So SHA-2 went through a standardization process. It's really battle tested, achieves all of the properties you would want from a hash function, but it's really slow inside of a SNARK. And the reason why it's really slow inside of SNARK is because the things that make a hash function or any arithmetic on a computer really fast are a lot of bitwise operations. So this works with bytes and words. So each letter here is representing a variable which is 32 bits, so a word on a computer. And then it uses operations which act on these bits. So this happens, practically instantly on your hardware. XORing is really cheap. Rotations, great. And inside of a SNARK, this is exactly what you do not want. So if you're working in an arithmetic field, you don't have a 32-bit word. There's not really such a thing. So what you have to do instead is separate all of these into 1 bit per field element, and then do all of the XORs and ANDs and rotations in a bitwise fashion, which is terrible. So it's not what you want. So this leads to a proof for a SHA-2 hash having about 27,000 constraints, which is huge, for a 512-bit message to be processed. And one of these proofs creates 1.5 seconds, which maybe isn't that bad by itself, but if you want to do multiple of these, it's going to be terrible fast. This means it's about 54 constraints per bit processed. So you're doing, almost 54 multiplications per every bit you're processing. This is, it just looks, we have a lot to improve here. So maybe if you think about the ways that we can improve, maybe first we can relax our conditions. So SHA as a hash function, it satisfies a lot of properties that you want from a hash function. But if you want to just use your hash function for commitments, then it's maybe a simpler goal. So commitments require only second preimage resistance, which means that given a message, it's hard to find another message that hashes to the same, the output of the hash function is the same, or collision resistance, which is you choose any 2 messages such that the output of the hashes is the same. So what happens if we only need this goal? And maybe we can first construct something which is simple that just satisfies this. So the reason why we would need just this goal is because in Merkle trees, which are used a lot in cryptocurrencies that use SNARKs, for example, we often have commitments to coins or to transactions that are constructed in a Merkle tree, and at each layer of this you need to use a hash function, but your hash function only needs to be collision or second preimage resistant. So we definitely have the motivation. So, and we also have a solution. So thanks to Sean Bowe, who you had earlier today, and Dara from Zcash, they constructed this really good hash function that satisfies exactly the requirements you need in this case. It's called the Pedersen. It's a Pedersen hash, and what you do is you split up your message into its bits, or you could split it into little bit chunks, and then you have generators which are the GI in this case, and you can just multiply like little sections of your message by each of these generators. And this is great because instead of where we had bit arithmetic before, we now have field arithmetic. So now instead of like 1 and between 2 bits being 1 multiplication, we have that 1 multiplication is 1 multiplication. So we've made some progress. You can do windowing, which is like instead of where I've written here each bit is a labeled M, you can construct little chunks instead. So maybe every MI would be like 3 bits. And you can hard code some parameters, and then you can use some lookups, which saves you on doing the multiplications. You kind of like pre-compute the multiplication, so then instead of reperforming it, you can just say like, it's one of these 8 values if it's 3 bits, and this is the one that it is. So this leads to about 1.7 constraints per bit instead, which is, if you recall, the last one was 54. Like, we've already done a great job. So Sean and Dara should definitely be praised for that. So it leads to around 900-ish constraints for a 512-bit message. And also an important thing to stress here compared to the hash functions that I'm going to be presenting next is like this one has provable security from the discrete log assumption. So if you want to be conservative in your assumptions that you're using, you don't want to move fast and break things, then and you only need properties that are needed for commitments, then this one is a great choice. But what happens if you don't just need commitments, like you don't just need collision resistance? Then you need indifferentiability from a random oracle. So you need your hash function to look, its output to look random. And common use cases which you need this for example, in Schnorr signatures. So if you replace the verifier and prover interaction instead with a hash function, then you need that hash function to have like a random looking output. And as well, if you want to compose like SNARK verification with some of the newer SNARKs that are being produced, like the universal setup SNARKs, a lot of the time these use the Fiat-Shamir transform as well, which is, it's the same. It's like if you have an interactive protocol where you have a prover and verifier, and you can replace that verifier interaction with a hash function as well. So this is a way that a lot of the newer like universal setup SNARKs get rid of interactivity. And so if you want to compose with one of those, if you want to verify that inside of a SNARK, then you want your hash function to behave randomly. So what do we do here? So there's been a line of work. So there's MIMC hash. Originally this was started because in MPC in some types of MPC, you have a similar computational model that you get addition for free and multiplication you really have to pay for in terms of communication there. So MIMC hash was suggested, and then there were like, this is just more work that builds on MIMC hash. Then the more recent line of work, of which we have one of the authors in the room, there's a pair called Vision and Rescue and a pair called SNARK and Poseidon. And these are papers that are written for the motivation of hashing inside of SNARKs. So like they really take care to make sure that you're not wasting any multiplications. So the pairs, because one of each of them targets a binary field and the other one targets a prime field. So we have Rescue and we have Poseidon. So I'm gonna do some thought leadership here and tell you like which one I would conclusively use. And so for that we need to take a look inside of them, kind of. So Poseidon is made, and Rescue as well, are made of these 3-stage layers. So this is like one round, and you repeat this many times depending on like what security level that you're comfortable with. So the ARK layer is just add round key. So you add a constant in this layer. So inside of a SNARK, that's free. Then the M layer is like matrix multiplication. So this is also by a constant. It's by some like constants. And so this is also free inside of a SNARK. Then the little S in boxes, they're called S boxes. And this is like a kind of hash design taken from the hashes that were designed way before SNARKs even existed. So the combination of these things is like something which people maybe believe is secure. So what happens inside the X box is really what's most important. And Poseidon itself has some partial layers, they're called, in the middle, which only use one of these X boxes instead of putting the whole state through an S box, just to even more simplify the arithmetic complexity of the entire circuit. And the like concrete numbers are like approximately 228 constraints in the case of MNT 4 and 6's curves, which remember they're 753-bit curves, so you would have a really bad time in all of the other situations with these, but this one, it's very, yeah, you get 0.3 constraints per bit processed because you also are working in field elements straight away here. So processing one field element is processing 753 bits already. So you don't, you get a lot of efficiency straight away. So what do these X boxes themselves look like? So in Poseidon, you have x to the alpha as your S box, and this needs to be a bijection, which means you have to use alpha as you should use alpha as the smallest prime so that your prime minus 1 is not divisible by that prime. So you should be, p minus 1 should be co-prime, or r minus 1 in this case should be co-prime with the prime number that you use as alpha. So it recommends that you use 1 over alpha if 3 isn't co-prime with r minus 1, but we chose alpha equals 11 instead because this is our smallest prime that's co-prime with p minus 1. So rescue uses both x to the alpha and x to the 1 over alpha as X boxes, which is exactly the same number of constraints inside the SNARK, but if you want to be nice to your prover as well, then they might want to produce this hash function outside, or run the hash function outside of the SNARK as well. And 1 over alpha, raising a number to the power of 1 over alpha when all of the arithmetic is modulo 700, like 2 to the 753 almost, is very slow outside of SNARK. Like, to do this on a computer, your computer is not very happy with you. So, so if you, after speed, the recommendation is that you would use Poseidon. However, one caveat is that I haven't really said anything about the security of these recently suggested hash functions, and so I'm going to defer to Alan, who's talking right after this about exactly that. So, like, contrasting the security of these. That's his job. So what happens instead if, so far we've been hashing to like field elements. So we've been hashing to practically bit strings. We don't need the output of the hash function to have any special structure. Like in some cases, you do need the output of the hash function to have a special structure. You're hashing to an elliptic curve point. And just to like say what this is in one line, if you don't like, hashing to an elliptic curve point is kind of maybe a weird phrase. So you just want to sample a random elliptic curve point so you don't know the discrete log, pretty much. And it's like, it's a random elliptic curve point. So the motivation for this, one of them is verifiable random functions. They rely on this super heavily. Password authenticated key exchange as well. Like, I've not seen this happen in a SNARK, but if you want verifiable password authenticated key exchange, then this would be a use case where you would need this. And then like if you want to verify BLS signatures inside of a SNARK, you also need to do this. And that one will be important for like light clients for any protocol that uses BLS signatures, for example. So just to motivate why verifiable random functions use hashing to elliptic curve points, because it's kind of interesting. These, instead of the normal back and forth where you prove that you have a private key that corresponds to a public key, this is kind of what Schnorr signatures look like. Instead, you prove that with this curve point, which is the output of a hash of a message, then you get to multiply your secret key by that hash of a message. And if, for some notion of like order, if the output of that hash function multiplied by your secret key is larger than a target value, this counts as like winning the lottery in some proof of stake protocols, like Aurora's Genesis, for example. So like where in proof of work you do the like repeated hashing, and if you find one that has a bunch of zeros at the start first, then you win. the proof of stake equivalent of like how you win the lottery is you do a multiplication by the output of like a hash of a message, and if I've just said your x coordinate is larger than some target value, but if you have some ordering, then you can define who wins the lottery. So this proof looks just like Schnorr. So if you're familiar with Schnorr, Schnorr would just look like all of the h prime to the m here is you're proving that the number that you multiplied by h prime of m is your secret key. So, and as I said before, in Schnorr as well, you need to replace the verifier by a hash function. So here Bob is replaced by a hash function. And then another motivation is SNARKs with private input. So maybe this isn't talked about very often, but Groth 16, you can't actually put private information right in and not have malleability. So if you, so there's just a security property that says like, if you want this idea of like, if you can only want people to be able to construct proofs if they have a valid witness or know a valid witness, then you want simulation extractability rather than the security property that's in Groth 16 by itself. And one of the extensions which gets you this is Bo-Gabazon 18, and this does it by including a message hashed to elliptic curve point as well. Like this stops people being able to like malleate the proof. So in this case as well, you would want an efficient inside of SNARK hashing to elliptic curve. So what does SNARK-friendly hashing to elliptic curves hashes look like? So we saw in Sean's talk as well, there's such a thing as an embedded curve, and this is like the curve which is defined over the scalar field of the original curve. So this is where the SNARK arithmetic takes place. So this is kind of saying there is such a curve. So like, does hashing to elliptic curves inside of a SNARK make sense as a phrase? And so what this slide is saying is like, yes, it does. If you have elliptic curve points defined with their coordinates as the points in the like original scalar field, then you can define a curve. So this just means that arithmetic inside of the SNARK can be used to describe an elliptic curve. You can like efficiently ascribe a elliptic curve group operation. Yeah, so it just means the rest of my slides are going to make sense. So the first idea that you might try is called try and increment, and this is kind of like the folklore way to get an elliptic curve point. And the way that you do this is you have, you just use a normal hash function. You hash your message, you say like, if this was an x of an xy coordinate pair on elliptic curves, would it make sense? And if it does, then you say like, great, so I can solve the equation, I can solve the curve equation, I can get my y. And if it doesn't, then you add 1 to that x. And then you say like, is this one the solution to the curve equation? If it is, then you're great. If it's not, then you move on. So you can do this. Outside of a SNARK, it's like an okay way to go about life. But finding inside of a SNARK, it's kind of difficult. So finding whether or not f of x itself, which is defined here as like the curve equation, is a quadratic residue. So if that's a square, if that's going to have a square root, so is y going to exist? Finding out whether or not that has a solution, that takes an exponentiation, which means like of order of the field size bits. So in our case, 753 constraints just for that. And then square rooting itself. So if that is a valid solution to that problem, then you need to square root in order to find your y. And this can either be done with one more exponentiation, so 753 more constraints, or with like a whole algorithm of its own, which is like significantly more than that. Yeah, so we have that this, you need to add 1 for approximately half, and then on and on and on. And there's very many like analytic results about how well distributed the x's are. So like, are you going to have to add 50 before you find something which is a square, or are you only going to have 1? Like there's not very many results about that. And so to be conservative so that you don't run into like bad cases all of the time, you're going to have to set that k parameter pretty high. And in SNARKs, there's no way to say like, I'm done now, let's cut short from this loop. And so every time you want to do this, you're going to have to do it the way that you would do it in the worst case. And so it leads to like very many constraints very fast. And then, so maybe the next thing that you would think of is like, how about we use a hash function that we just defined before? Those ones were really cheap, right? And multiply it by g, and then we'll have an elliptic curve point. And this doesn't work because if you look at BLS signatures, everything is terrible if you use this as your hash function. You can immediately forge just from someone's public key and from whatever message that you want. The signature scheme kind of doesn't exist as a signature scheme anymore, because you can just, it's just because this equation holds, and so using only public information, you can just construct signatures that are completely valid. It's also expensive. So moving on to the non-expensive ones. These are the hashes to elliptic curves of the pre-SNARK literature also. So you have Icart-style encodings. They have these like pretty simple equations. First you define like this little rational function, and then you have this one. So this is great if you're, So this only achieves one-wayness, number one. So this isn't by itself a solution to our problem. This is also, but this bit is solved. So you can extend this by just kind of using it twice. You just double everything, as in like double all of the formulas. You can create a hash function which can be modeled as a random oracle. But this one assumes that your prime is 2 mod 3. And this is because it uses cube rooting. And it needs cube rooting to be a bijection, which it means r minus 1 can't be divisible by 3. So this doesn't work in our case. So then there's another suggestion. This one is pretty cool. So here G is the curve equation. So pretty much you can pick 3 x points and then construct the curve equation for each of those. And because we have that this is equal to a square, there's like results from number theory which say things multiplied together that are equal to a square, at least one of them is a square. So what you can do is you can construct these, instead of like the k-many that you had to do in try and increment, you can just construct these 3 versions of the curve equation, and then one of them will have a square root. So the formula again looks like this. It looks silly in its LaTeX, but it's pretty low complexity arithmetically. And then you can also make sure that this one is extended in order to satisfy the requirement of indifferentiability from a random oracle. Then really recent work of Damvenet and Riyad Wabi, I think, removes all of the restrictions from this one, generalizes it. It proposes a construction that even works in BN curves. And so this one's all good. It's like full speed ahead with that one. So, but what happens if we could do better than this because we're inside of SNARKs? So the Wabi-Benet paper just targeted like constant time hashing to elliptic curves. They didn't consider that it would maybe be used inside of SNARKs. And what can we do inside of SNARKs? So inside of SNARKs, instead of, for example, if we just wanted to compute a square root, then you can imagine that instead of having to compute the square root inside of the SNARK in the field arithmetic, with all of the multiplication gates counting as constraints, you could instead, if you wanted to prove something that has a square root, you could just feed in the square root and instead prove that that thing that you just gave squared is equal to your original number. So instead of doing a long, complicated square root algorithm, you just do a multiplication and then you make sure that the things are equal. So you just like add to your witness. So this takes us from runtime, which is a cube of log r, which is how long square rooting usually takes, to constant. So you just do one multiplication. So maybe we could use this to our advantage. So each of the x's in the formula from the page before are actually parameterized by another t. And so like how do we get that t? We use one of the hash functions that we just said. So we use, inside of a SNARK, we're going to use Rescue or Poseidon. Then we want to pick the first square. So checking the squareness outside of the SNARK is an exponentiation. Checking it inside of a SNARK uses one of the, it uses also an exponentiation. But what happens if we have different ways to witness the fact that it's square or non-square? And it turns out that we do. So we can use what I just said before to witness that it is a square. So if it's a square, it has a square root. And so you can just submit the square root and then square it inside of the circuit, and then you're finished. But what happens if it's not a square? So what happens if someone lies to us and they say, like, this one's not a square? How do you observe that something isn't a square? And it's because of this other result, which is like a square multiplied by a square in a prime field is still a square. But a non-square multiplied by a non-square in a prime field is a square. So if you choose a non-square, which is like, so QR is quadratic residue, which is just like a mathematician's way of saying a square number in a prime field. If you have a pre-computed non-square, then you can only multiply things by this, which are non-square, in order to produce a square. So we have two cases now. So either you submit the square root, like I said before, which is called x in this case, that solves your equation, and then that can be checked inside, or you submit the square root of the, or you submit the square root of the number that you're wishing to prove is square or non-square, multiplied by this hard-coded non-square. So then this square root will only exist if the number A in this case is not a square. So then we have that you increase the witness size by 2 elements, you give the square root of either A or A multiplied by your beta, and then you can check that the square of this is either, this is just a bit, so the bit is showing like this is either square or non-square. If the bit is 0, then you're in the non-square case, and if the bit is 1, then you're in the square case. So either way, that equation will have a solution. And this is how we do it. So in summary, you can submit different things to your SNARKs and like rearrange equations a bit and save a lot of constraints. SNARKs and hash functions can work together as friends. Thank you.